Crimson stains don't deceive, and the gore streaked along. Thaddeus Whitmore's boundary markers revealed a tale. He preferred not to decipher. For 12 years, nothing had broken the quietude of his homestead, save wind and livestock. But there she lay, crumpled beside the aged timber, her gown ripped, breathing, faint living. Yet scarcely Thorn had constructed this seclusion, intentionally following what befell his kin. Following the blaze, following the charges that pursued him like vapor he'd selected. This void, no homesteaders for leagues, no collars, no entanglements, merely him, his herd, and the sort of tranquility that stems from being overlooked by the globe. He stood 30 feet distant, firearm relaxed in his grip, examining the lady who destroyed his meticulously built solitude. She appeared no older than 30, ebony locks, tangled with grime and something murkier, her palms pressed to her flank. Where material had ripped and gore had leaked through, she hadn't noticed him yet. Her gaze was shut. Face ashen as dawn ice, every impulse yelled at him to pivot, walk back to the dwelling act as if he'd never spotted her. In his understanding, aiding outsiders only created problems, and problems was the one matter Thorn Whitmore had pledged never to welcome back into his existence. But she moved against the barrier. A faint noise escaping her mouth, anguish blended with weariness. Something in that noise pierced. Through 12 years of deliberately constructed barriers, he discovered himself moving forward. Then again she revealed her gaze when his silhouette dropped across her emerald eyes. Keen despite the suffering, and they locked on him with a blend of terror and frantic desire that made his chest constrict. She attempted to talk, but only achieved a murmur he couldn't entirely grasp. Thorn squatted, keeping the firearm across his thighs, keeping separation. Even as he approached nearer, up close, he could observe the scope of her wounds. Cuts on her limbs, bruising across her chin, and that gash on her flank that had saturated through her gown. Someone had harmed her severely. She succeeded in speaking. Then her voice, broken and hoarse, pleased their approaching. Those two phrases altered everything, because if someone was approaching, if someone was pursuing this lady, then his 12 years of tranquility were about to conclude, whether he aided her or not. And Thor Whitmore was about to confront the one decision. He'd spent over a decade evading becoming involved in someone else's battle, but as he gazed into those frantic emerald eyes, he understood. The decision might already be determined for him. Thorn's initial urge was to abandon her there, his second was to assist his third. The one that prevailed was to obtain responses before either choice got him eliminated. Who's approaching? He inquired, glancing toward the skyline where dirt clouds could conceal advancing horsemen. She attempted to sit up straighter, grimacing as the motion tugged at her. Injuries, men from Dead Rock Gorge, 3 of them, perhaps 4. Her voice bore the sort of fatigue that came from fleeing hard and far. They've been pursuing me since yesterday. Dedrack Gorge. Thorn knew the location, a community 40 miles south, renowned for 2 things: silver extraction and the sort of men who posed no questions about a person's history if she'd escaped from there. She'd either taken something precious or witnessed something. She wasn't meant to observe. What did you accomplish? The question emerged harsher than he meant. But 12 years of seclusion had eroded most of his social refinement. Her eyes blazed with something between fury and pain. What makes you assume I committed anything improper? Because guiltless people don't typically wind up bleeding against my fence marker with murderers following their path. She glanced away, her jaw clenching for a moment. He believed she wouldn't respond. Then she spoke, so softly he had to bend closer to listen. I witnessed them slay a family. The Hendersons. They possessed a claim near the gorge, discovered something worth murdering. For her hands shook as she pressed them firmer against her flank. I was there to purchase provisions. Wrong location, wrong moment. Thorn studied her features, looking for the signs that would identify her as a deceiver. He'd become skilled at interpreting people in his years before the seclusion had to be in his profession. But her eyes remained steady, and the quiver in her voice sounded like shock, not deception. So you fled. he stated. What else was I meant to do? Remain and let them silence the sole witness. She met his stare again. They murdered an entire family over whatever. The Hendersons discovered you believe they'd hesitate to kill one additional person. A noise drifted across the grasslands, distant but unmistakable hoofbeats. Multiple horses riding hard. Thorn rose to his feet, firearm-ready eyes scanning the horizon. There a dirt cloud perhaps 2 miles out, moving fast toward his land for riders just like she'd stated the lady. He still didn't know her identity, struggled to stand using the barrier for support. Please, she whispered, I won't create you problems. Just direct me toward water and I'll continue fleeing. But Thorn was already calculating 4 armed men, probably frantic to hide their actions if they'd murder a family for whatever the Hendersons had discovered. They wouldn't leave witnesses, and now that they'd pursued her to his land, he was already involved. Whether he preferred it or not, the hoofbeats were growing closer. In less than 10 minutes, those riders would summit the hill and see his ranch. They'd see her, they'd see him, and Thor Whitmore would have to decide whether 12 years of peaceful seclusion was worth perishing. For Thorn made his decision in the space between one pulse and the next, not because he was courageous, and certainly not because he was reckless. He made it because he recognized something in the lady's eyes, the same frantic, trapped expression he'd seen in his own reflection 12 years ago. Can you move? He asked, already advancing. She nodded, though the way she gripped the fence marker suggested walking would be more wish than reality. My identity's Serafina Caldwell, she stated as he slipped an arm around her waist, supporting her weight. Sarah Thor Whitmore, and we're about to become very well familiar with my root cellar. The cellar was his security measure, a concealed space beneath the kitchen floor where he'd kept emergency provisions. And if he was truthful, where he'd planned to hide if his history ever pursued him. He'd never envisioned hiding someone else. As they rushed toward the dwelling, Sarah stumbled her legs, failing without thinking. Thorn lifted her up, carrying her the remaining distance. She was lighter than he'd anticipated, delicate in a way that made his chest tighten with an feeling he'd buried years ago. The hoofbeats were louder now, close enough that he could distinguish individual horses inside the dwelling. Thorn seated Sarah down and pulled up the hidden trap entrance. The cellar was compact, but well-supplied, water preserved. Food, medical provisions. He'd learned the importance of readiness. The difficult way, there's wrappings down there, he stated, helping her down the ladder. Treat your injuries. Remain silent no matter what you listen to. Sarah seized his wrist before he could shut the entrance. Why are you assisting me? You don't know me, don't know if I'm speaking the truth. Thorn looked down at her raised face, saw the genuine bewilderment there. How long had it been since someone had shown her compassion without expecting something in exchange? Maybe I recognize the expression of someone fleeing from something they can't combat, he stated quietly. Maybe I understand what it's like to have nowhere else to turn. Before she could respond, he shut the trap entrance and scattered the carpet back over it. The approaching horses were maybe a minute away. Now he could hear them clearly for riders, just as Sarah had stated, their mounts breathing hard from a long pursuit. Thorn checked his firearm, then moved to the window. The riders topped the hill in a cloud of dirt and rage spreading out as they approached his land. Hard men with harder faces, the sort who wore their brutality like other men wore. Cap's the leader, a tall man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw raised, his hand bringing the group to a halt 50 yards from the dwelling. Even at that distance, Thorn could see the cold calculation in the man's eyes. You Whitmore, the scarred man called out. Thorn stepped onto his porch, firearm held casually but ready. Depends who's inquiring. Name's Kane Murdoch. We're pursuing a lady. Dangerous criminal. You seen anyone come through here and there? It was the falsehood that would force Thorn to choose between his security and his conscience, because he could see in Murdoch's eyes that this man had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Thorn had deceived before, during the war, after the war, and in the dark years. That followed when truth was a luxury he couldn't afford, but standing on his porch facing Kane Murdoch, he realized this falsehood would cost him. Everything he'd built, haven't seen a person in weeks, Thorne stated, his voice steady despite the weight of the firearm in his hands. Gets solitary out here, but that's how I prefer it. Murdoch's eyes narrowed, scanning the land with the thoroughness of a man who'd tracked quarry before his gaze lingered on the fence markers where Sarah's gore had dried dark against the weathered timber. Funny thing, Murdoch stated, dismounting. With practiced ease, we followed her trail right to your landline gore trail. Two lady was hurt bad when she passed through the other three riders. Spread out, not threatening exactly, but positioned like men who knew how confrontations ended. Thorne recognized the formation. He'd used it himself in another life. Gore could be from anything. Thorne replied, coyotes hunt through here regular. Maybe your lady tangled with something with fangs. Murdoch smiled, but it was the kind of smile that preceded violence. Mind if we take a look around just to ease our mind? It wasn't a request. Thorne could see that in the way Murdoch's hand rested near his gun, in the way the other men watched his every movement. They'd search his land, whether he agreed or not. The only question was whether they'd kill him first or after. Free country, Thorne stated, stepping aside. Though I'd appreciate you not disturbing my livestock. They startled easy as Murdoch approached the porch. Thorne caught sight of something that made his gore run cold. Mud on the man's boots, but not just any mud, the distinctive crimson clay that only came from one place in this territory, the same clay that covered the Henderson land near Deadrock Gorge. Sarah had been speaking the truth. Murdoch was close enough now that Thorne could smell the stale whiskey on his breath, see the dried gore under his fingernails. This wasn't just a killer. This was a man who enjoyed his work. Nice place you got here, Whitmore, Murdoch stated, his eyes taking in every detail of the dwelling. Quiet, private, the sort of place where a man could conceal things or people. I'm a simple rancher, Thorne replied, don't have much use for concealing anything. Simple rancher, Murdoch chuckled. That's what they all say. But you know what? I think you got secrets, Whitmore. I can smell them on you, one or the other. Riders called out from near the barn. Kane found fresh horse tracks. Someone was here recent. Thorne's mind raced. Those would be his own tracks from this morning's ride to check the fence line, but Murdoch wouldn't know that, and in his current mood, the man was likely to assume the worst. Murdoch's hand moved closer to his gun. Thought you stated you hadn't seen anyone. I stated I hadn't seen a person. Didn't say I hadn't left my own land. Thorne kept his voice level, but his finger found the trigger of his firearm. Rode out to check my fence line this morning. Found some markers. Damaged, probably the same animal that left that gore. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Thorne could feel the weight of the moment, the terrible balance between truth and falsehoods, between security and catastrophe. Then Murdoch smiled again, and Thorne knew that whatever happened next, his 12 years of tranquility were about to end in brutality. The tension broke when Murdoch stepped onto the porch uninvited. That single act crossed a line Thorne had drawn in Gore 12 years ago. No one entered his sanctuary without permission. Let's have that look inside, Murdoch stated, his hand now resting openly on his gun. Thorne raised his firearm an inch. Not quite a threat, but close enough to make his position clear-eyed. Rather, you didn't, wasn't asking. Murdoch's three men moved closer, their intentions written in the way they positioned themselves. This was about to become a fight, and they all knew it, but before anyone could draw, a new noise cut through the tension. Hoofbeats approaching fast from the east, a single rider pushing his horse hard across the open ground. Murdoch cursed under his breath, his attention divided between Thorne and the approaching stranger. In that moment of distraction, Thorne caught a glimpse of something that made his heart sink. One of Murdoch's men was studying the ground near the porch, following a trail Thorne couldn't see but knew was there. Droplets of Sarah's gore leading toward the dwelling. The approaching rider topped the ridge, and Thorne could see him clearly now. A young Man may be 25 with the kind of frantic urgency that came from carrying bad news. He pulled up hard in front of the group, his horse lathered and breathing heavy cane. The young man called out, "We got problems back in Dead Rock, sheriff's asking." Questions about the Henderson place. Someone tipped him off. Murdoch's face went dark with rage. What kind of questions? The kind that end with a rope. If we don't clean this up fast. The young man's eyes darted to Thorn. Then back to Murdoch. We need to ride now. For a moment, Thorn thought salvation had arrived, that Murdoch would be forced to abandon his search and deal with the larger threat. But then, Murdoch's gaze fell on those drops of gore leading to the dwelling, and his expression shifted to something infinitely more dangerous. Curtis, Murdoch stated to the man tracking the gore trail, "What did you find?" Curtis pointed toward the dwelling. "Gore trail leads right to the front entrance." She's here. The words hit Thorn like a physical blow. His deception had been discovered, and now 4 armed killers stood between him and the lady he'd sworn to protect. Worse, they were frantic men facing a hangman's noose if they didn't silence every witness. If you were Thorn, what would you do? Fight for armed men to protect a lady you barely know, or try to negotiate your way out and hope they spare both your lives? Tell me in the comment. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Thorn decided next would determine whether either of them lived to see sunset. Murdoch drew his gun with practiced speed. "Bring her out, Whitmore. Do it now, and maybe we'll make this quick for both of you." But Thorn was already moving. His 12 years of seclusion stripped away in an instant, revealing the man he'd been before, a man who'd learned that sometimes the only choice to fight. Thorn's firearm cracked like thunder, and Curtis dropped before his gun cleared leather. The shot echoed across the grasslands like a judgment, and suddenly the quiet ranch became a battlefield. Murdoch dove behind his horse as Thorn's second shot splintered the porch post where his head had been. The other 2 men scattered, seeking cover behind the water trough and barn wall. Years of muscle memory kicked in. Thorn's hands worked the firearm action smooth and fast, just like he'd learned in the war, just like he'd hoped never to use again. "You picked the wrong side, Whitmore," Murdoch shouted from behind his horse. "All this for some lady you don't even know." Thorn didn't waste breath on answer. He put a round through the water trough, sending the man behind it scrambling for better cover. The messenger, young and clearly unused to gunfights, had wheeled his horse and was riding hard back toward the ridge, apparently deciding that whatever waited in bedrock was preferable to Thorn's firearm. Smart kid. Murdoch appeared around his horse's flank. Pistol-blazing bullets chewed splinters from the porch railing as Thorn dropped flat, rolling behind the heavy wooden bench he'd built for quiet evenings he'd never have again. The silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. Thorn counted shots, calculated angles, tried to remember everything he learned about staying alive when outnumbered. 2 men left besides Murdoch, both of them with clear shots at the dwelling if he showed himself. Then he heard a noise that made his gore freeze, the trapdoor creaking open. "Don't," he called out, but it was too late. Sarah's voice drifted up from the cellar, weak but determined. "Let me help. I can shoot." "Stay down," Thorn hissed, but she was already climbing up, a pistol in her hand, his spare Colt that he'd kept in the emergency provisions. Murdoch heard the exchange and laughed, a noise like breaking glass. "That's right, girl. Come on out. Let's finish what we started at the Henderson place." Sarah appeared beside Thorn, her face pale but her hand steady on the gun. Gore had soaked through the makeshift wrappings she'd applied, but her eyes burned with something beyond pain. "They killed a little girl," she whispered to Thorn. "Sarah Henderson. She was only 8 years old. Murdered her because she saw them kill her parents." The words hit Thorn like bullets. An 8-year-old child. Sudden Lisses wasn't about protecting a stranger anymore. It was about justice for the innocents these men had butchered. "How many rounds you got?" Thorn asked. 5 in the gun, plus whatever's in your belt. Thorn checked his firearm. 3 rounds left. Against Murdoch and 2 experienced killers, it wouldn't be enough for a straight fight. But then he remembered something: the old mining explosive he kept in the barn for clearing stumps. Dangerous to store, but effective for more than just moving rocks. Can you keep them busy for 2 minutes? He asked. Sarah nodded, though sweat beaded her forehead from pain and effort. What are you planning? Something foolish. Thorn checked the distance to the barn: 30 yards of open ground, where any of the 3 men could cut him down, but may be foolish enough to work. He looked at this lady he'd known for less than an hour, this stranger who'd brought brutality back into his carefully ordered world. She could have attained concealed, could have let him face this alone. Instead, she'd chosen to stand with him ready. He asked. Sarah positioned herself at the corner of the porch, Colt steady in her hands for Sarah. Henderson. Thorn sprinted toward the barn as Sarah opened fire, her shots forcing Murdoch and his men to keep their heads down. But 30 yards had never seemed so far, and Thorn knew that any second one of those killers would risk Sarah's bullets. For a clean shot at his back, Thorn's boots hit the barn floor as a bullet whistled past his ear, close enough to feel the heat behind him. Sarah's Colt barked steadily, keeping the killers honest. He dove toward the corner where he kept the mining provisions hands, searching frantically for the small wooden box marked with skull and crossbones, their 2 sticks of dynamite fuses intact. Enough explosive to level half the barn or turn the tide of this fight. His fingers found the matches as another bullet punched through the barn wall, showering him with splinters. Outside, Sarah's shooting had stopped. Either she was reloading or she was down. Thorn didn't have time to find out which. He lit the first fuse with shaking hands, the spark catching with a sharp hiss. 20 seconds, maybe 30 before it blew. He sprinted back toward the barn entrance, dynamite in one hand, firearm in the other. Sarah was still alive, crouched behind the porch, railing with gore running down her arm from a fresh graze. She saw him emerge from the barn and nodded. She understood what he was planning. Murdoch's voice rang out across the ranch. Give it up, Whitmore. You're outgunned and outmanned. Send the girl out, and maybe I'll let you live. Instead of answering, Thorn hurled the dynamite toward the water trough where 2 of Murdoch's men had taken cover. The stick tumbled end over end, fuse sparking like a fallen star. The explosion shattered the morning air, sending dirt and debris skyward in a massive geyser. When the dust cleared, one of Murdoch's men was motionless on the ground. The other was crawling away, stunned and bleeding. But Murdoch himself had used the chaos to advance, and suddenly he was at the porch steps, gun trained on Sarah's head. Drop it, Whitmore. Murdoch's face was a mask of rage and desperation. Drop it, or I paint your porch with her brains. Thorn froze, firearm halfway to his shoulder. 30 feet separated him from Murdoch. But it might as well have been 30 meters at this range. The killer couldn't. Miss Sarah looked at Thorn across that impossible distance, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Not terror, acceptance. She'd made peace with dying, probably made it back in Dead Rock Gorge when she decided to be the witness. These killers couldn't silence. Don't. She stated quietly, don't let him win. But Murdoch was already squeezing the trigger when the second stick of dynamite, the one Thorn had lit but kept hidden behind his back, rolled to a stop at the killer's feet. Murdoch's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening. He had, perhaps, 3 seconds to choose between shooting Sarah and diving for cover. He chose wrong. The blast lifted Murdoch off his feet and hurled him backward, his gun spinning away into the dirt when the ringing in Thor's ears faded. The ranch was silent, except for the wind and the distant lowing of spooked livestock. Sarah was alive, shaken, but breathing. Murdoch lay motionless near the shattered remains of the porch steps. The surviving gunman had disappeared entirely, probably decided that whatever the sheriff in Dead Rock might do to him was preferable to facing more explosives. Thorn walked slowly to where Sarah sat, his firearm still ready but no longer needed. She looked up at him with those emerald eyes that had changed everything. Is it over? She asked. Thorn surveyed his destroyed ranch, the shattered porch, the crater where his water trough used to be, the gore soaking into earth that had known Only tranquility for 12 years, Ye stated, reaching down to help her stand. It's over. 3 days later, Sheriff Morrison arrived from Dead Rock Gorge with a posse and questions he found Thorn repairing his porch while Sarah sat nearby, her wounds healing but her presence permanent in ways neither of them had planned. Morrison was a good man, honest in a territory where honesty was often fatal. He listened to their story, examined the bodies, and nodded. When Thorn handed over the ore that Murdoch had been carrying, evidence of the silver claim that had gotten the Henderson family killed. Henderson found a vein worth murdering for Morrison explained, hefting the ore sample. Murdoch and his crew figured they could eliminate the family and claim the strike for themselves. They almost got away with it. The sheriff's eyes lingered on Sarah, taking in her healing wounds and the determined set of her jaw. You willing to testify in court about what you witnessed? Every word, Sarah replied without hesitation. Sarah Henderson deserves that much. Morrison nodded and turned to Thorn. And you've got quite a reputation from your war days. Some folks might wonder why a man with your skills chose to hide out here for so long. Thorn's hands stilled on the timber. He was planing sometimes a man needs to find tranquility before he can make it for others. Well, you made plenty of tranquility here. Murdoch's gang was terrorizing half the territory. Words already spreading about what happened. You might find folks coming by to shake your hand. The thought of callers of his seclusion being permanently broken should have filled Thorn with dread. Instead, he found himself glancing at Sarah, who was watching him with something that looked like hope. After Morrison and his posse left taking the bodies and their grim evidence, Thorn and Sarah sat on the partially rebuilt porch as sunset painted the sky in shades of fire. You could go anywhere now, Thorn stated quietly. Morrison offered to escort you to Denver, help you start fresh where nobody knows your story. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the livestock move across the pasture in the dying light. And you, what will you do? Same as always. I suppose work the ranch, tend the livestock. He paused, then looked at her directly. Though it occurs to me that this place could use a lady's touch and maybe some extra hands for the work. Are you offering me a job? Thorn Whitmore, I'm offering you a home if you want it. Sarah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night I've been fleeing for so long. I'd forgotten what home felt like. It feels like this, Thorn stated, and for the first time in 12 years, he meant it. 6 months later, travelers passing through the territory would tell stories of the peaceful ranch where a scarred man and an emerald-eyed lady built something beautiful from the ashes of brutality. They raised livestock and children, welcomed strangers, and never spoke of the day when Goron fence markers changed everything. Thorn kept his firearm cleaned and ready, but he never had to use it again. Some battles once won, stay won, and some tranquility once earned lasts forever. The ranch that had sheltered one broken soul became a sanctuary for two healing hearts, proving that sometimes the best things in life begin with the courage to help a stranger in need. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, more intense, more profound, the sort that makes your soul pause and your heart race.